In the mist-covered lands of ancient Britannia, where thick forests whispered secrets of old gods and the rivers ran red with war, a fierce queen rose like a flame in the dark. Her name was Boudica, a name that would echo through the corridors of history, soaked in both blood and legend. She wasn't born into violence, but violence found her and transformed her into a symbol of vengeance, fury, and unyielding resistance against the greatest empire the world had ever known, Rome. Boudica's story begins in a time of uneasy alliance. Her people, the Iceni, a proud Celtic tribe from what is now East Anglia, had long kept a tenuous peace with the Roman invaders. Her husband, King Prasutagus, ruled as a client king, nominally independent but submissive to Roman authority. When he died around 60 CE, he left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and to Emperor Nero, hoping to protect his family from the cruelty of conquest. But Rome had no respect for such wishes. The empire respected only strength and obedience. In a brutal betrayal, Roman soldiers stormed the Iceni lands. They seized the kingdom, enslaved the nobles, and most horrifying of all, they flogged Boudica publicly and raped her 2 young daughters. This act of desecration did more than violate a queen. It awakened an ancient wrath buried deep in the Celtic soul. Boudica, once a queen of peace, now burned with the fury of a mother wronged, a leader betrayed, and a goddess incarnate seeking revenge. As the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus marched west to crush a Druid stronghold in Mona, modern-day Anglesey, Boudica saw her moment. The Roman military presence was scattered. The time for revolt had come. She called upon not just her own tribe, but neighboring peoples who had suffered under Roman taxation, confiscation, and cruelty. The Trinovantes, another oppressed tribe, joined her cause. Soon, a massive coalition of Celtic warriors, men, women, and even elderly fighters, rallied behind her flaming red hair and thunderous voice. Boudica was not just a warrior, she was a prophet of vengeance. Mounted on a chariot adorned with blades, she became a vision of terror. Eyewitnesses, even among the Romans, described her with awe, tall, with piercing eyes, wild copper hair cascading down her back, and a voice that could silence entire crowds. She was divine fury made flesh. Their first target was Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, the former capital of Roman Britain, and a symbol of imperial arrogance. The Roman veterans there had been living in luxury, mocking and abusing the native Britons. The city fell quickly. The Roman garrison, understaffed and unprepared, was annihilated. Temples were burned, statues of the emperor were smashed, and the streets ran with Roman blood. Boudica's revenge had begun. But she didn't stop. With each victory, her army swelled. Next came Londinium, now London, a Roman trade hub that was evacuated in panic by Suetonius. The Britons torched the city to the ground, leaving behind only charred ruins and the bones of those who could not escape. Following that was Verulamium, St. Albans, which suffered the same fate. By the time the dust settled, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 Romans and sympathizers had been slaughtered. Boudica's fury was unrelenting, a firestorm consuming everything in its path. The fire of vengeance that Boudica unleashed swept across Roman Britain like a storm from the old gods, sudden, violent, and merciless. But as her campaign grew, so did the challenge of controlling an army of tens of thousands. While her warriors fought with the fury of the oppressed, their tactics remained rooted in tradition, relying heavily on sheer numbers, close combat, and the will of the gods. In contrast, the Romans, cold and methodical, relied on discipline, engineering, and formations honed through decades of conquest. As Boudica's forces left Londinium in ashes, Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus regrouped. He had only a fraction of the Roman legions at his command, roughly 10,000 men, yet he knew he couldn't allow the rebellion to continue. Britannia was in chaos. Trade routes were blocked, Roman citizens were fleeing or slaughtered, and whispers of rebellion spread to other provinces. Rome's image of invincibility was crumbling beneath the boots of tribal warriors and the bloodied wheels of Boudica's chariots. Suetonius chose his battlefield carefully, a narrow defile flanked by dense woods, likely in the Midlands, though the exact location has been lost to time. There, Roman discipline could neutralize Boudica's numerical superiority. His men formed into the tight testudo, tortoise, formation, shields interlocked, pila, javelins, in hand, their backs protected by the terrain. They were outnumbered perhaps 6-1, but they had experience, armor, and cohesion. Boudica arrived at the battlefield with what was likely the largest native force ever assembled against Rome in Britannia. Estimates range from 100,000 to 230,000 warriors. She rode her chariot between the ranks, her daughters beside her, their young faces painted in the warlike blue of the woad plant, embodying both the innocence lost and the vengeance sworn. Her speech, though never recorded verbatim, survives in Roman accounts. She invoked freedom over slavery, called upon the gods to witness their courage, and reminded her people that they had nothing to lose, only the chains of Roman cruelty. Then the horns blew. The Britons, fueled by rage and faith, charged, but they were met with calculated Roman brutality. The legionnaires hurled their pila into the mass, piercing shields and bodies alike. As the Britons stumbled, the Romans advanced in tight ranks, stabbing methodically with their short gladii, pushing the enemy into chaos. The narrow terrain turned against the rebels. They had nowhere to maneuver. Worse still, many had brought their families in wagons behind the battlefield, expecting victory and celebration. These carts blocked any retreat. What followed was a massacre. Tens of thousands of Britons died that day. Bodies piled upon bodies as the Romans moved forward like a machine. The battle that was to liberate Britannia became the grave of its fiercest warriors. The rebellion was over. But Boudica, she would not be captured. According to most Roman sources, including the historian Tacitus, Boudica took her own life with poison, refusing to fall into enemy hands. Others claimed she died of illness or wounds sustained in battle. Her body was never found. No monument marks her grave. She vanished into the earth, like a myth, returning to the soil. Yet her spirit remained. Rome would go on to solidify its control over Britannia for centuries, but it was never without fear. Boudica had shown them that even the mightiest empire could be shaken by the wrath of a woman with nothing left to lose. The land where she rode her chariot is still whispered about in local legends. Some say her ghost rides at night through the forests of Norfolk, her daughters beside her, seeking justice still denied. The legacy she left behind was more than military. Boudica became a symbol of national resistance, of female power, of the undying fight against tyranny. In the centuries to come, her name would be resurrected in poems, songs, statues, and stories. Queen Victoria herself admired her so much that a statue of Boudica was raised in London near Westminster Bridge, a silent bronze reminder that even Rome could tremble before a mother's wrath. But history, as always, is written by the victors, and the Romans made sure to portray her uprising as savage, irrational, and doomed from the start. They emphasized the bloodshed, the barbarism, conveniently ignoring the injustice that birthed it. They tried to bury Boudica's story in shame. In the smoldering silence that followed Boudica's final battle, a strange stillness settled over Britannia. The air, once alive with the roar of rebellion and the crackle of burning Roman cities, now held only whispers of what had been and what might have been. But while the swords had stopped clashing, the war was far from over. It continued in the minds of those who had survived, in the scars etched deep into the hearts of the Iceni, and in the quiet terror that now clung to the Roman soldiers stationed across the island. The Romans declared victory, but it was hollow. Though they had defeated the Iceni in battle, they could not destroy the flame Boudica had ignited. They saw it in the eyes of every tribal leader who bowed under pressure, in every peasant who offered grain with a clenched jaw, and in the way, silence fell when a Roman officer passed through a village. Rome had subdued the body of the land, but its spirit had been awakened raw, rebellious, and waiting. In the decades that followed, Roman governance in Britannia shifted. Lessons had been learned. The brutality that once defined Roman taxation was tempered with caution. More military garrisons were built. Infrastructure, roads, forts, walls, expanded rapidly, but these were not signs of dominance. They were signs of fear. Rome had realized that underestimating a people's pride and pain could lead to disaster. Boudica had taught them that. Meanwhile, among the native Britons, her name began to evolve. No longer was she just a queen, she became a myth. Mothers told their children tales of the warrior queen who made Rome tremble. Poets spoke of her as a force of nature, sent by the gods to punish the unjust. In some oral traditions, she was even deified, her chariot thundering through the skies during storms, her voice echoing in the wind. But the most profound transformation happened in the collective soul of her people. For centuries, Britons had lived under the weight of Roman rule, some adapting, some resisting, most simply surviving. Yet now, they had a symbol of defiance. Boudica became the embodiment of resistance, a spiritual anchor for the oppressed, a reminder that even the smallest fire can blaze into an inferno. This psychological resistance was perhaps more dangerous to Rome than any blade. It bred quiet subversion, small acts of rebellion, and a refusal to fully assimilate. The Celtic traditions, the Druidic rites, the reverence for nature, the matrilineal respect, continued in secret. Though temples to Jupiter and Mars were erected, many still whispered prayers to the old gods in hidden groves under moonlight. Yet, the memory of Boudica wasn't confined to Britain alone. Her name reached Rome itself, spoken with a mix of disdain, admiration, and fear. Some Roman senators questioned the cost of colonizing distant, hostile lands. Others wrote her off as a savage rebel, but in private letters and soldier journals, her legend grew. She was the queen who had burned 3 Roman cities to the ground, the woman who led a nation into battle, the mother who turned her grief into a weapon. Centuries passed, and Rome eventually crumbled not from a single battle, but from the weight of its own contradictions. Empires fall, and stones turn to dust, but legends endure. When the Roman legions finally withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, they left behind walls, baths, coins, and ruins, but also the lingering echo of Boudica's cry for freedom. In the ruins of Verulamium and the ashes of Londinium, that echo waited to be rediscovered. During the Renaissance, as scholars began translating old Roman texts, Boudica's name emerged again from the shadows. In the writings of Tacitus and Cassius Dio, her story found new life. And in Elizabethan England, a nation seeking its own identity in the face of foreign threats, Boudica was resurrected as a national heroine. Playwrights and poets retold her saga, drawing parallels between her fight and England's struggles against Spain and other powers. As the 19th century dawned, and the Victorian age ascended in Britain, the sun never seemed to set on the expanding British Empire. With colonies stretching across the globe, Victorian England sought symbols of imperial grandeur, national pride, and unbreakable resolve. In that moment, the ancient ghost of a Celtic queen began to stir once more. Her name, once feared by Romans, was now revered by the empire that inherited their mantle. Boudica was no longer just a historical figure, she was a cultural icon. Writers, politicians, and scholars reached back into Roman texts and reimagined Boudica through a patriotic lens. She was elevated to a near mythical status not as a rebel, but as a proto-British monarch, a defender of liberty, a mother of the nation. This rebranding was no accident. In an age when Queen Victoria ruled an empire, it was politically useful, even poetic, to evoke an ancient queen who had once stood against tyranny. Boudica became Victoria's symbolic mirror, 2 powerful queens, both presiding over vast realms, both mothers in the service of their people. The rewriting of her legacy took physical form. In 1902, a grand bronze statue of Boudica was erected near Westminster Bridge, facing the Houses of Parliament. Atop a war chariot drawn by snorting horses, she is flanked by her daughters, spear raised defiantly, a vision of wrath, justice, and strength. It stands near the heart of political power, reminding every passerby of a time when a woman brought an empire to its knees. But this new Boudica was not without contradictions. The Victorians praised her as a defender of civilization, even as they themselves were colonizers. They honored her for fighting foreign domination, while simultaneously subjugating nations across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The irony was profound. The empire that exalted Boudica had become the very force she once fought against. In turning her into a symbol of imperial pride, they erased part of her essence, her rebellion, her rage, her sorrow. They sanitized the blood from her hands and silenced the screams of her daughters, replacing raw vengeance with noble resistance. Still, the story could not be fully tamed. Beneath the patriotic veneers, there were artists and thinkers who saw through the myth-making. They recognized the pain in her eyes, the trauma that fueled her fury, and the moral complexity of her cause. They told her story not as propaganda, but as tragedy, a woman pushed to the brink, consumed by fire, and ultimately destroyed by the very forces she sought to destroy. Throughout the 20th century, as Britain's empire began to wane, Boudica's image continued to evolve. In the feminist movements of the 1970s, she was resurrected once again, not as a queen or a symbol of empire, but as a woman wronged, a mother violated, a warrior who refused to be silent. Her legacy became a rallying cry for strength, autonomy, and rage against systemic oppression. The contradictions in her story made her relatable to many causes. To some, she was the voice of the colonized, a native who refused to kneel. To others, she was the guardian of national identity, a figure of cultural preservation. To others still, she was a feminist icon, proof that women could lead, fight, and terrify even the most powerful men in the world. But perhaps Boudica's true power lies in her adaptability. Like all great myths, she is malleable, timeless, and deeply human. Her story can be retold in many forms: a mother's tale, a queen's war, a nation's dream, a tragedy written in ash and blood. She represents not just the fight for freedom, but the cost of it, the pain it demands, the darkness it leaves behind. And in that, her story becomes more than historical. It becomes eternal. As we march deeper into the modern age, Boudica continues to resurface in film, literature, art, and popular culture. Each generation finds something new in her, some mirror of its own struggles. Whether as a fierce freedom fighter or a tragic warrior queen, her essence continues to haunt the conscience of nations. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Boudica, that history's most powerful figures are not those who win, but those who cannot be forgotten. In the 21st century, where social movements rise and fall like waves, Boudica's story has found a new and fertile ground. Her rebellion, once confined to dusty textbooks and imperial monuments, now pulses with relevance in a world still grappling with themes of oppression, resistance, identity, and trauma. Though her revolt occurred nearly 2,000 years ago, the emotional current of her journey is timeless. Because in Boudica, we see not only a historical figure, but an archetype, the embodiment of defiance, especially when the world expects silence. In an age of mass surveillance, systemic inequality, and authoritarian resurgence, the image of a woman who dared to rage against an empire resonates more than ever. In Boudica, activists, feminists, and truth-seekers across the globe find inspiration. She represents the courage to speak when speaking is dangerous, to act when action seems futile, and to rise when rising appears suicidal. The injustice she faced, the violation of her body, the desecration of her family, the silencing of her people mirrors the struggles of countless voices across modern history. Consider how her story parallels modern movements. The violation of her daughters recalls the deep wounds of generational trauma passed through victims of war and sexual violence. Her public humiliation by foreign rulers draws a chilling similarity to the experiences of colonized nations across the global south. And her transformation from queen to warrior, from diplomat to destroyer, mirrors the metamorphosis of countless individuals who are radicalized by relentless abuse, who learn that sometimes peace is not granted, but must be torn from the throat of tyranny. What makes Boudica particularly compelling in modern consciousness is that she didn't start as a warrior. She was a wife, a mother, and a queen. She likely tried to preserve peace. She endured betrayal. And it was the violation of her daughters, not politics, not religion, not even conquest, that set her soul on fire. In her, we see how personal suffering becomes political fury, and how the most powerful revolutions often begin with the cry of a grieving mother. Across media, filmmakers have begun reimagining her tale not simply as a period piece, but as a psychological and emotional war story, a tale of transformation, trauma, and legacy. She is often portrayed not just with swords and chariots, but with haunted eyes and a voice heavy with sorrow. This shift is not accidental. Audiences today crave depth. They crave truth. And Boudica's pain, when stripped of myth and sanitized glory, is achingly real. Her story also serves as a mirror held up to modern power structures. Just as Rome justified its occupation of Britannia under the guise of civilization, modern empires, economic, military, cultural, often mask domination with benevolence. Boudica reminds us that behind every imperial claim to order lies a graveyard of silenced voices, and she stands, eternally, with those who were not heard, who were trampled, who were told they had no choice. Moreover, her rebellion raises uncomfortable questions about revenge and morality. The slaughter of tens of thousands during her uprising, civilians included, forces us to reflect on what happens when vengeance overtakes justice. How far should one go for freedom? What are the consequences of righteous fury when it spills beyond control? These questions are not easily answered, and they make Boudica's story not just inspiring, but deeply tragic. This duality of heroism and horror is why her legend endures. She is not a perfect figure. She is a burning soul wrapped in contradiction, and that is what makes her real. Because no true rebel is spotless, and no war for freedom is bloodless. In literature, she has become a muse. In music, a metaphor. In political discourse, a symbol. And for everyday people, especially women, she is an ancient whisper that says, "You are not powerless. You can rise, you can rage, and even if you fall, your voice will echo long after the empire that silenced you has turned to dust." And perhaps that is her ultimate revenge. The story of Boudica is not just about war, or Rome, or Britain. It is a story about human rage, resilience, and the deep, primal hunger for justice. It's about what happens when a single individual, scorched by loss and betrayal, refuses to submit and in doing so, ignites the fire of 1,000 others. What began as the tragedy of one family, a queen widowed, her daughters violated, her kingdom stolen, erupted into an explosion of rebellion that shook the very foundation of the Roman Empire. And though Boudica's body may have fallen, her spirit never did. Her soul scattered like ash on the wind, but took root in the minds of those who still believe in resistance. The truth is, Boudica didn't win, at least not in the way battles are usually counted. The Romans crushed her army. They regained control of their provinces. They claimed the victory. But look closer. Rome fell. Boudica remained. Her story, passed from mouth to mouth, from scroll to parchment to screen, lived on. It refused to be buried, refused to be edited out. And today, nearly 2 millennia later, we remember her not as a footnote, but as a flame. That's real victory, to be remembered not for what you conquered, but for what you refused to surrender. The moral of her story is not black and white. It's not simply fought your oppressors, it's deeper than that. It's about recognizing when silence becomes complicity, when diplomacy fails to protect your dignity, when your pain, if left unvoiced, will rot inside you until it erupts. Boudica teaches us that sometimes fire must answer injustice. But she also teaches us caution. Rage, once unleashed, can consume both the oppressor and the oppressed. Her revolt burned bright, but it burned fast, and it took innocence with it. This is the price of unchecked fury, that justice, when wielded without clarity, can become indistinguishable from the evil it seeks to destroy. Still, despite the blood, the ashes, the ruin, we need her story. Because we are still fighting. Every generation faces its own empires, systems that crush the spirit, violate the weak, silence the different. And every generation needs its Boudicas, not just warriors with swords, but teachers, writers, leaders, mothers, daughters, people who dare to say, "No more," people who, like her, rise from trauma not broken but reborn. Perhaps that's the final image we should carry with us, not of her last battle, not of the corpses, nor the flames, but of her standing tall on her chariot, eyes fixed on the horizon, hair wild with the wind, daughters at her side, not marching for conquest, but for vengeance, for memory, for justice, for dignity. Let her remind you that history is not just the past, it is a living current beneath our feet, shaped by every choice we make. We are all part of it. And we all, in some way, must decide when to speak, when to rise, and when to fight. So if you've ever felt silenced, trampled, forgotten, remember Boudica. If you've ever seen injustice and feared your voice wouldn't matter, remember Boudica. And if you ever doubt that one soul can rattle the walls of power, look to the woman who made an empire bleed. Because the empire may always strike first, but the rebel is eternal. Thank you for watching this video. We ask that you subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted when we post. See you in the next video.